Alright, hello everyone and welcome back to US History. So today we're going to talk about the end of World War I. Here are our objectives and standards again. We're going to look at and conclude why European leaders and Americans rejected Wilson's 14 points. And later on, after this lesson, you'll get a chance to decide if you would have supported Wilson's plan for peace as well. Our vocabulary preview. Our words are armistice, 14 points, Treaty of Versailles, League of Nations, reparations, and the War Guilt Clause. So again, we'll discuss them later on in this lesson. Our essential question. So we're going to look at the major reasons why Americans rejected the Treaty of Versailles. So think about this. Why would a country reject a peace treaty? So Americans turned the tide. So when Russia pulled their forces out of World War I, Germany was free to focus all of their attention on the Western Front and France. Germany had been fighting a two-front war. They were fighting the Russians on the Eastern Front. They were fighting the French and the British on the Western Front. So after Russia pulls out of the war, Germans are able to take all of their soldiers and supplies and resources and focus them towards the Western Front and France. So with France under pressure from German forces, the Americans show up at a pretty good time. And the American forces were able to stop the German offensives in France and force the Central Powers to go on the defense. So there's going to be an armistice, okay? So Austria-Hungary surrendered to Allied forces on November 3rd, 1918. Shortly after that, there's going to be some military revolts and labor revolts in Germany against the German government. And on November 9th, 1918, the Kaiser is going to leave the throne. So 2 days later, on November 11th, 1918, Germany is going to surrender and sign an armistice or a truce to end World War I. So on the 11th day of the 11th month of the 11th hour, World War I comes to a close. Here's a table for you to look at. I know it's kind of difficult to read, but it kind of shows you the casualties of World War I. At the top, we have the Central Powers, and again, there were other countries involved, but the graph names some of the major players, and at the bottom you have the Allies, and you can see at the bottom there the United States is the least amount, and you may be wondering why that is, but you have to remember that the United States entered the war in 1917 and was in the war for about a year or so before the war came to a close. So not to belittle the dead or the wounded, but that's why the United States numbers are less than some of these other countries, because these countries have been fighting the war for a longer period of time. So Wilson presents the 14 points. When Wilson arrived in Europe to present his plan for world peace, he was really hopeful it would pass. You can see a picture of him there at the bottom of him arriving in Paris, waving to the crowds. He was welcomed by Europeans, well-liked and everything like that. And earlier in the year, in January 1918, he had already addressed his 14 points to Congress. Now, there are three categories to Wilson's 14 points. There are points to prevent another war. There are points that dealt with boundaries, and there's also points that speak about a League of Nations organization. So you can see this a little clearer here. Here's Wilson's 14 points. His first category was to prevent war. Some of the things he mentions was no secret treaties between nations. Remember that alliances was a big part of why World War I started. He also mentioned freedom of the seas. Again, remember we talked about the German U-boats attacking ships. And ships that were civilian ships sometimes. He also talked about tariffs, which are basically taxes on goods and things like that. They should be abolished or lowered. He talked about reducing arms, so he talks about basically gun control, and this is still an issue in the world today. Many of you are aware, I'm sure. So he talks about reducing arms and trying to stop the aggressiveness of the world. And he also talks about considering colonial people. Remember that at this time in the world, we still had a lot of colonies, especially in Africa, that had ties to European countries. So he just kind of mentions that those people should be taken into consideration as well when discussing the future of the world. His next category talked about boundaries. Again, kind of talking about the colonial people, he talks that boundaries should be decided by historical groupings of people. So instead of taking just kind of drawing lines all over a map and just saying, okay, now this is a country, okay, now this is a country, he says that countries should be created where, where people of common backgrounds and societies, that's where countries should be created. And he also said, again, that people of different backgrounds should be able to choose their country or choose where they want to live or be able to create their own country. He thinks that this would solve some of the world's problems. And finally, Wilson talks about a League of Nations. What this was an international organization that would address diplomatic problems. Kind of a precursor to the United Nations, if some of you have ever heard of that, and we'll discuss that later on in the course, but the League of Nations was kind of basically an onset to the current United Nations. So Europe is going to reject Wilson's plan. You might be wondering why. I mean, it sounds pretty good, right? And Wilson thought the same thing. Wilson didn't understand the anger that European nations had after World War I. For one thing, France had been invaded by Germany before, so they wanted to stop any future invasions by the Germans, and that man is going to be Georges Clemenceau, and there's a picture of him there. He was the Prime Minister of France. Great Britain wanted to punish Germany and basically make them pay, and David Lloyd George, that picture of that gentleman there, he basically ran for prime minister, and based on the whole phrase of make them pay, make Germany pay. And finally, Italy, they just want to control the Austrian-held territory from World War I. There's a picture of Vittorio Orlando was his name. So getting to the Treaty of Versailles, only the Big Four victors of World War I were invited to the Peace Treaty Conference. And they would be, if you're looking at the picture, you have David Lloyd George from Great Britain, Vittorio Orlando from Italy speaking to him. The man looking towards the camera is Georges Clemenceau from France, and then the man turned to the side would be President Woodrow Wilson of the United States. So no Germany, no Russia, no Austria-Hungary, only these Big Four sat down and talked about the treaty. Seems a little unfair if you think about it. Now, Wilson again comes to Europe with his 14 points plan, and Europe is going to shut a lot of those points down. The only thing he's going to get out of is basically the League of Nations. So he had to give up his idea of the other 14 points that we had seen earlier in the lesson, and he's only going to get the League of Nations. So peace at last. On June 28, 1919, the victors and the defeated countries met at the Palace of Versailles in the Hall of Mirrors and signed the peace treaty. And I kind of just outlined some major points of the treaty here for you. The treaty created 9 new nations and split up the Ottoman Empire among France and Great Britain. So they're going to divide up the Ottoman Empire and give the territory and colonies to France and Great Britain. Germany would not be allowed to have a large army anymore. They're only allowed to have an army that can defend the country from attack. They're not allowed to have an army more that could attack another nation. And they had to return this area called Alsace-Lorraine to France. Germany also had to pay war reparations or war damages for the things that they had caused to the Allies. There's also this thing called the War Guilt Clause. And what it basically did was it blamed Germany for all of World War I. Which is really unfair. And a lot of Germans are going to be upset with us. A lot of people around the world are going to be upset with us as well. But the War Guilt Clause blames Germany for all of World War I. And it also stripped Germany of territory possessions in the Pacific. So Germany gets hit pretty hard by this treaty. Again, we talked about Russia and the colonies. What about Russia? Well, there's no mention of Russia in the treaty. Russia is left out of it. And what about the colonies? Well, again, they're also left out of it as well. So the treaty has to come home to the United States to be ratified by the U.S. Senate as law in our Constitution. So when Wilson came back to the United States, he faced a lot of opposition over the treaty. A lot of Americans, again, thought it was too harsh on Germany, thought it was very unfair. But the main opposition to the treaty was the League of Nations. A lot of Americans felt that the League of Nations would put the United States and its isolationism policy at risk. Remember, isolationism is, kind of sticking to your own country, not worrying about what's going on in the rest of the world. So a lot of Americans felt that if the United States became part of the League of Nations, that we would get involved in other world affairs that we didn't need to be involved in. Okay, so debating the treaty. So Wilson wanted the treaty to be approved by the Senate, and he goes on an 8,000-mile trip around the United States and gave speeches in support of the treaty. Unfortunately, this tires him out a lot. It would tire anybody out. And on October 2nd, 1919, Wilson suffered a stroke, and he was left paralyzed and with little to no voice. So very kind of sad story for that. The treaty came up for a vote in the Senate in November 1919, and it comes to a vote, and the treaty fails, even with some amendments that were proposed to the League of Nations and to the treaty. It still fails. So the treaty is going to eventually fail. So Wilson refused to give up hope on this. In March 1920, the treaty came up for a Senate vote yet once again. The treaty is going to fail again for the last and final time, and the United States will sign a separate treaty with Germany that brought an end to World War I between the United States and Germany, basically. Even though there'd already been an armistice, this was just kind of officially end the war as well. The United States never joined the League of Nations. Great Britain, France, and some other countries will remain a part of it, and the United States will remain an official observer to it. But eventually, the League of Nations will also come to an end as well. Okay, so to wrap it up, World War I ends. When Americans go over to Europe, they start bringing a lot of support, and they turn the tide of the war, so the war comes to an end. With the Treaty of Versailles, Wilson lost many of his 14-point ideas except the League of Nations, and Germany is really going to suffer with the treaty, and we'll see how that comes to play in the next couple of years about how Germany feels about being treated after World War I. And Wilson is going to fight for the treaty. He's unsuccessful at getting the treaty ratified, and the United States is never going to join the League of Nations. Okay, guys, that's all I have for today for this lesson. Make sure you answer the questions, and next class we'll start talking about the 1920s and getting into the political atmosphere that was going on then. All right, have a good day.